current debates on immigration, not least in letters to the Eagle, you often see recently arrived Hispanics compared to earlier immigrants from Europe, almost always to the detriment of Latinos. No doubt you've heard concern that the current wave of immigration is slower than earlier waves to move into the American mainstream and may never enter it at all. Now, for me as a historian of immigration, less disturbing than what people don't know about immigration history are the things that they know that simply aren't true. Recent immigrants are held up to an almost impossible standard of the melting pot of the past. But as I'll show, this was a much slower and messier process than it appears in romanticized hindsight. Nevertheless, and this is my second major point, although earlier immigrants often preserved their ancestral languages and culture, politically, most identified fully with the United States. And a third minor point that I just talked about in Poland is that ethnic and racial minorities interacted not only with the dominant white society, but also with each other. My first example might seem to contradict my thesis. I mean, what could be more mainstream than a Texas German Aggie? William A. Trankman was born of two immigrant parents in 1859, a few miles south of Brenham. He enrolled in the very first class of Texas A&M in 1876 and finished as valedictorian of its first graduating class in 1879. Now, if any T-SIPs have snuck in here, they might be thinking, valedictorian, impressive. Aggie valedictorian, not so impressive. And admittedly, A&M was not the academic powerhouse in Trankman's day that it is now. But he didn't just stop at valedictorian. He went back to his home county, and after a few years as a school teacher and principal, in 1891 he founded a weekly newspaper, which he continued to publish for 42 years. After the turn of the century, he was elected to 2 terms in the Texas legislature and continued his publishing career from Austin. He served A&M as a member and later chairman of the board of directors and was even offered the presidency. On the side, he found time to author several works of literature and history. So at first glance, Trankman would appear to be a second-generation German totally integrated into the Texas mainstream. Mainstream, that is, until I mentioned the name of Trankman's newspaper, Das Belleville Wochenblatt, or his historical novel, Die Lateiner am Possum Creek, or his play, Der Schulmeister von Neu-Rostock, or his memoirs, Erlebtes und Beobachtetes. Although born in Texas, he and his entire family visited relatives in Germany in 1903, where this photo was taken. There's no doubt that Trankman himself was fully at home in the English-speaking world, but his readers may not have been. Well beyond the immigrant generation, there were Texas Germans, also outside the hill country, who preferred or needed to remain in a foreign language backwater. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, and it applies not only to Germans, though they were by far the largest group of European immigrants in Texas, and in fact outnumbered the Mexican-born until the Civil War and stayed neck and neck with them as late as 1890. When Texas Germans are mentioned, the first place that initially comes to mind is New Braunfels or Fredericksburg. Not exactly wrong, but if you think that's all there is to Texas Germans, you miss some important aspects. Both towns have their roots in a colonization project of the mid-1840s and represent the areas with the heaviest percentage of Germans, but there was another focus of settlement farther east in Texas and farther back in time that actually attracted greater numbers of Germans, although they weren't as isolated there. Trankman grew up in industry, the first German settlement in Texas established in 1832. This town, about an hour's drive south of Aggieland, still forms the approximate center of the German settlements of eastern Texas, that big blot there. It's close to the borders of Austin, Washington, Fayette, and Colorado counties, all of which were among the top 10 in numbers of Germans, and they were all in one county. It'd be almost as heavily German as in the hill country. Terry Jordan's maps here show the absolute number of Germans in 1850 and 1880, with each dot representing 25 persons. If you go by percentages instead, and this includes the second generation, the hill country, of course, stands out more. Speaking of New Braunfels, some of you may recall the controversy in 2006 over a Spanish translation of the national anthem, criticized, among others, by President Bush. Well, he probably didn't know about this. It has no obvious Texas connection. In fact, this is a New York broadside from the Civil War. But the translation is by a Texas German, Hermann Seele, the first school teacher of New Braunfels and future mayor. It was first sung in Galveston in an 1851 4th of July celebration that also saw the reading of the Declaration of Independence in German. A lively translation that captures the spirit of the anthem without being slavishly literal. It was still being sung in the bilingual public elementary schools of Indianapolis in 1917. But this particular image appealed to Civil War recruits, not only to save the Union, but also to break the chains of slavery, as you can see from the figure on the right. So, where were Texas Germans in this fight? The late great UT geographer Terry Jordan found his fellow Germans, quote, unremarkable on questions of slavery, race, and secession. But I disagree, as you can read in my 1999 Southwest Historical Quarterly article. Jordan is certainly right that Germans were never fully unified on any of these issues, but I provide strong evidence that they stood apart from the Texas mainstream on all of them. Germans had much lower levels of slave owning than could be explained by wealth alone. And Texas was one of the few states that put the issue of secession up to a popular vote. And here, too, the Germans stood apart, as did Hispanics. Now, you tend to think of the Confederacy as being quintessential white bread America, but Texas ordered that its secession declaration and declaration of causes in the Confederate Constitution be published not only in English, but also in 2,000 copies of German translation and an equal number in Spanish. However, the German copies largely fell on deaf ears. Across Texas, secession won by a landslide, but two German frontier counties in and around Fredericksburg led the state with a 96% margin against secession. A majority of Germans statewide voted in opposition, whereas 3/4 of Texans voted in favor. Texas German unionism was epitomized by the Battle of the Nueces, or Nueces Massacre, of dissenters from the Confederacy attempting to escape to Mexico. Their hometown of Comfort erected the only monument to Unionists put up by locals within the former Confederacy. As Jordan and others have pointed out, not all Germans agreed, and many served in the rebel army, if often reluctantly. To further investigate this matter, I made a quick and dirty estimate of ethnic loyalties by searching for common Anglo and German names on Union and Confederate muster rolls in Texas. Of every Texan soldier named Smith or Jones on the National Park Service's database of Civil War soldiers, one finds that less than 1% of them served the Union. But searching for two leading German names, Schmidt and Meyer, in the same data, reveals that those who rendered military service, 1 in 9 remained true to the Union. And there's an even higher percentage among Hispanics, but their situation is a bit different. For Hispanics, Union enlistment didn't require a perilous journey of several hundred miles to Brownsville as it did for Texas Germans. German reservations towards slavery and secession were shared by most other continental Europeans in Texas, One sees very similar patterns with Czechs, Poles, Wends, the Alsatians around Castroville, and Norwegians out in Bosque County. Most served reluctantly as Confederate troops, if they served at all, and often in the same units with Germans. In one instance, 2 whole companies of Germans and Poles switched to the Union side after being captured in Arkansas. Now, I get the impression that some Texans still wish the U.S. had been divided into a second-rate power and a banana republic, but I'm kind of glad the Civil War turned out the way it did. So if Germans stood apart from the Texas mainstream, well, and other immigrants as well, they had taken their naturalization oaths to the United States and were closer to the national mainstream than most Texas Anglos. After the war, Germans still stood apart, often voting Republican during Reconstruction and even beyond. 48er Edward Degener, who lost 2 sons in the Nueces Massacre, was elected as the first Texas Republican congressman from a district heavily populated by Germans and Latinos, though 2 years later he was replaced by a German Democrat. Now that Republicans are PC again in Texas, I'm surprised that to this day there's not a school in the entire state named after Degener. Maybe I could get some young Republicans behind the campaign if I didn't tell them he was a freethinker. Now, one reason for increased German political influence is that many were voting before they became citizens. Now, if you're shocked by this, you shouldn't be. It was legal. The Constitution of 1869 gave the right to vote to immigrants before they were naturalized if they had been here 2 years and filed a declaration of intent to become a citizen. Texas only repealed this provision in 1921, one of the last states of the 20 or so that allowed this so-called alien suffrage to abolish it. After the Civil War, there were other concessions made to ethnic Texans. When the new Texas Constitution was up for ratification in 1875, an additional language was added to the mix. Besides 5,000 copies in German and 3,000 in Spanish, 1,000 were published in Czech translation. Speaking of Czechs, they got along with Germans much better in Texas than they did in the old country. Some of the evidence is written in stone. This Catholic edifice in Schwetner, an hour's drive north of Austin, has a cornerstone reading Holy Trinity Church in Czech, German, and Latin. Where's the English, you might ask? Apparently it's on the side that's mortared into the wall. Closer by, just 60 miles due south of here, lies one of the oldest German settlements in Texas, home to the Cat Spring Agricultural Society, the oldest agricultural society in the state, founded in 1856 with Trentman's father as its president. But by 1900, the county also counted nearly 900 Czechs among its residents. The Agricultural Society was still keeping its minutes in German down to 1942, giving an impression of insularity. But in other respects, Cat Spring Germans were not bound by narrow ethnic chauvinism. During the 2 decades before World War I, the Society's festivities were not bilingual, but often trilingual, with Bohemian, as they called it, speakers invited to give addresses alongside German and English. Czechs made up a significant minority on the Society's membership rolls, easily outnumbering Anglo-Americans. Although there's no record of Bohemian orators after 1914, there are Czech as well as German names among the musicians hired for the various dances and festivities. Bach's band from Fayetteville, for example, shows up from 1920 all the way into the 1940s. And this is not the only evidence of trilingual Texas. The biographical sketch of Rudolf Benjamin Spacek, born in 1884 in neighboring Fayette County, says that, quote, Czech was the language spoken at home, But everyday contact with Germans and classes at Professor Hill's German school made him proficient in that tongue as well. Now, in case you movie fans are wondering, he was not the grandpa of actress Sissy Spacek. That was his younger brother, Arnold. The Czechs should learn German is perhaps not surprising, as they were badly outnumbered. The Texas Germans would learn Czech is more remarkable, but here's what my former department chair, Walter Binger, writes about a third-generation Texas German farmer who grew up in the same county. Quote, "Grandfather spoke, read, and wrote German and English, and judging from the letters I've read, his English was better than most college freshmen these days." Nevertheless, Binger writes, quote, he seemed to prefer to do business in German, and when we went to town together, Taylor, he spoke to bankers, filling station attendants, and others in German. And this would be in the late 50s or early 60s. And here's the part that amazed me. He and his mother spoke Czech, and I believe read a bit of Czech. I have found some legal documents that seem like tenant agreements in Czech, probably from his mother's farm. Now, newspaper publications give us a broader indication of the prevalence of ancestral languages in Texas. Swedes published several newspapers, but the longest surviving was the Texas Posten, established in Austin in 1896 and continuing till 1982, although with some English thrown in. San Antonio, at least briefly, had a Polish paper in 1914 and 1915. A French paper appeared in Brownsville in 1865 before it translated its title and continued in Spanish. Seems the editors were onto something. There were more than 50 Texas papers published in Spanish before 1900, though all but a handful were concentrated in just 4 cities. Brownsville, San Antonio, and El Paso were each home to at least 10, many of them short-lived, while Laredo claimed a half dozen. Despite the small size of the Czech population, there were no less than 33 newspapers and periodicals published here in that language. As of 1993, there was still 1 weekly newspaper in Granger and 1 agricultural monthly, Hospodar, from the town of West, that were being published entirely in Czech, and several others with some Czech text. The only thing I can read on this page is West and 2009, and it still looks like it's entirely in Czech. I can give more details on the German press. This slide shows 29 counties that in some time in their history were home to 1 or more German newspapers. Austin could boast a German paper from 1873 right down to 1940. Trinkmann's Wochenblatt outlived its founder by 5 years. Houston, Galveston, and Brenham all supported German papers down to World War I, and San Antonio even maintained a daily for that long. This Alamo City paper, the Freie Presse for Texas, appeared at least weekly for 80 years, from 1865 to 1945. And we can't forget the Großvater of them all, the New Braunfels Zeitung, established in 1852 as the state's first German newspaper, and also its last, surviving for more than a century until it finally switched entirely to English in 1957. Obviously, many of the people reading these journals in their later years were several generations removed from their immigrant ancestors. In 1940, the counties dominated by New Braunfels, Fredericksburg, and Giddings still supported German weeklies with circulations that were at least quadruple, and in 2 cases more like tenfold their German-born populations. German newspapers were still hanging on in all 3 of these counties when World War II ended. So we have strong evidence of multi-generational language survival and literacy. German language newspapers were often among the strongest supporters and also obvious beneficiaries of programs of foreign language instruction in the schools, public as well as private. You might think that bilingual education is an innovation of the radical 60s, And the way you're right, only it was the 1860s, not the 1960s, and it was often radical Republicans who were at work. The onset of Reconstruction witnessed a new Texas German assertiveness, culturally as well as politically. The Brenham Inquirer announced in January 1867, quote, "Our German friends are about to establish a first-class school in this place in which the English as well as the German language will be taught." There were similar ventures in Columbus, Houston, and Victoria. In 1888, when Trankman was principal of Belleville Public Schools, he reported the German instruction was offered in all 8 grades, with more than half of all pupils taking part. Nothing unusual for that era. Texas had nearly 7,500 children who were receiving German instruction, 3/5 of them in public rather than parochial schools. Now, this may not sound like many, but it was 6 times the number of German-born children of school age in the 1880 census, meaning that most of them were Texas-born. 2 of the more remarkable private bilingual ventures date from before the Civil War. Austin's German Free School was chartered in 1858 and survived until the mid-1870s when the city's first public education system was established. Its handsome 2-story limestone building on East 10th Street, just a few blocks from the Capitol, is in the loving care of the German Texan Heritage Society, and it's definitely worth a visit on Thursdays when it's open. But the most ambitious and successful of these bilingual institutions was the San Antonio German English School. Now, since World War II, if not earlier, San Antonio has been known as one of the most Hispanic cities in the nation. Despite the Menger Hotel, just a stone's throw from the Alamo, the German heritage and its multilingual era is almost forgotten. As early as 1855, you see Anglo, German, and even Swedish lawyers advertising in Spanish-language newspapers. The last entry, with the hand there, on Swede Juan Sundström is particularly interesting. He also spoke Spanish, French, and German, although he leaves out the Spanish in his English language ad. The immigrant founder of Pioneer Flour Company, Hilmar Günther, wrote home in 1859 that his 2.5-year-old son Fritz, quote, "speaks very distinctly, but occasionally mixes Spanish, German, and English all together." Not surprising given the city's ethnic makeup. In 1872, poet Sidney Lanier was amused to see a trilingual sign warning riders not to gallop their horses across the Commerce Street Bridge. Several years later, the American Encyclopedia characterized the population as being about equally divided between persons of Mexican, German, and American descent, as the 1880 census confirms. With a German population numbering around 5,000, San Antonio supported its German English school on a private basis with a small public subsidy, starting before the Civil War. There's the building. The rationale for the school's existence was its bilingual program. The charter explicitly stipulated equal status of the German and English languages. Today, we call it dual language or two-way immersion, like what Bryan ISD introduced in 2003, to such success that it was soon expanded to a second school in Bryan and also implemented in College Station. Meanwhile, back in San Antonio, reading, writing, grammar, spelling, and translation, composition were taught in both languages, along with translation in both directions. But German was truly a medium of instruction rather than just a subject. And the German English school was not just bicultural, it was truly multicultural, both in its program and in its student population. One of the expressed principles of the school was fully equal rights and mutual respect for all nationalities, and there were a bunch of them. The German English school was one of the few back then that also offered Spanish classes for non-Hispanics, though it was taught by Germans. Not that there's anything wrong with that. My wife is German, and she teaches International Baccalaureate Spanish at Bryan High. But the multicultural aspect doesn't just stop with Spanish instruction. It could also be seen in the student population. A tally by school officials in 1880 reveals that close to a fifth of all pupils were, quote, non-German. This obviously refers to language rather than birthplace, because by then only 2 of the 200 pupils were even born in Germany. By contrast, 8 were born in Mexico, though not all of Hispanic parents. Nearly 4/5 of all the pupils did have fathers with origins in Germany or German-speaking countries, including at least a half dozen Jewish families, one of which was also a prominent benefactor of the school. But a dozen pupils had roots in other European countries, and some 25 pupils from at least 8 different families, nearly a seventh of the total, had Anglo-American fathers. On the class roll pictured here, you see on the girls' side, Alvina Diaz, Annie Campbell, and Adeline Hernandez. Among the boys are Ernest Garcia, Eugene Thomas, and Walter Harrison. The German-English school enrolled the cream of the city's ethnic community. One finds on its rolls the entire second generation of the Günther family, whose descendants still own Pioneer Flour Company after more than 150 years. In fact, I found while editing this book that the written German of the Günther children was better than that of their immigrant mother, whose educational opportunities were limited by dodging Indians in frontier Fredericksburg. Among other of the Günther's schoolmates who later achieved prominence was Harry Wurzbach, who became a 6-term congressman, the first Texas Republican to be reelected. If you need further reassurance that the school was not un-American, here is a photo of the pupils sometime after 1877. Notice which flag they're flying. By 1880, the German English school was experiencing declining enrollments and financial difficulties, finally ceasing operations in 1897. In more homogeneous German settlements, especially in rural areas and smaller towns, German language and education persisted even longer. In New Braunfels, 100% of all grade school pupils received German instruction in 1900, 2/3 of them in public rather than parochial schools. In fact, the New Braunfels City Council had only switched its minutes to English in 1890. The book pictured on the next slide has no obvious Texas connections. It was originally published for the bilingual program in St. Louis, as you can see there. But it was still being used as late as 1916 in the public schools of Needville, about 40 miles southwest of downtown Houston. In their mindless wartime hysteria, school authorities had ordered all copies to be burned, but one book was rescued and preserved, ironically, by a Czech girl in the 2nd grade whose parents spoke both Czech and German and wanted the same for her. Speaking of World War I, let me take a brief detour to Nebraska, where local leaders in the hamlet then known as Germantown decided the town needed a more patriotic name. They resolved to rename it after the first local doughboy who gave his life for his country. But they passed over 2 men killed in combat because of their German names, Pohlmann and Riebling, about as bad as Kamphoefner. Instead, the town was renamed after a hapless soldier who caught typhoid fever on the ship over and died in an Army hospital on August 18, 1918, never having laid eyes on the enemy, much less come under fire. But he had the good Anglo name of Garland. You can look it up in your road atlas. Texas followed the same procedure, but it actually applied it fairly. This German town, about 10 miles west of Victoria, was renamed in honor of Paul Schrader, a 2nd-generation German who paid the ultimate sacrifice. If you need more evidence that American loyalty cannot be equated with English only, you can't do much better than this tombstone on the New Ulm Cemetery, fully bilingual in Czech and English. You might expect that from an immigrant, but this young man was of the third generation. His family had arrived in Texas before the Civil War, and both he and his two parents were born in Texas. Now, skeptics might say that he was motivated less by American patriotism than by the hope of an independent Czechoslovakia if the Austrians were defeated. But Texas Germans had no such incentives, and yet they served just as patriotically. In fact, the first Texas officer killed in World War I was a Fredericksburger of German heritage, Lieutenant Louis Jordan. Growing up on a ranch, he briefly taught school before winning a scholarship, and I hate to mention this to you folks, but to UT, where he was captain of the football team and their first All-American. Among the first to volunteer at war's outset, Jordan was commissioned a first lieutenant in August 1917, arrived in France in early October, and was the first man in his regiment killed in action on March 5, 1918. His grandparents were all German immigrants, and like almost everyone in Fredericksburg back then, he was bilingual. A football story mentions him spurring his teammates on, quote, with a few cuss words in German and some in English. One sports writer remarked, quote, it's ironic that a young man so proud of his German heritage would die from a German shell. His hometown, too, was proud of its son. The American Legion post there still bears his name, and when UT built a new Longhorn Stadium in 1924, Fredericksburg citizens erected a flagpole there in Jordan's honor. And he was no exception. The loyalty of Texas Germans was vouched for by none other than Colonel Mayfield, the publisher of a Ku Klux Klan weekly in Houston. Quote, the records show that our soldiers of German descent fought as valiantly overseas as those of families of longer resident in America. And I've confirmed this by looking at nationwide data. Service rates of German Americans were more than 90% of the national average, and just as high as for Czechs and Poles. But that didn't stop the Klan from arguing that, quote, the people who do not care to speak our native language should be driven from it. A bold-faced headline screamed, preach in English. One of the demands that the Klan made in Brenham was that soldiers' funerals not be conducted in German. Seemed like they just couldn't wrap their little brains around that. The Klan did not stop with a press campaign. In Brenham and rural Washington County, Klansmen used anonymous threats, beatings, and tarring and feathering in an attempt to force churches and other institutions to abandon their use of German. This notice was photographed on the door of a Lutheran church in Berlin, Texas, just west of Brenham. It got worse than that. A dispute over the use of German at a political rally put on by the Cat Spring Agricultural Society escalated several weeks later into a shootout on the streets of Sealy between Klansmen and Germans that left 4 people dead, 2 on each side, 1 German hospitalized with severe stab wounds, and a Klansman convicted of murder. And again, you want more detail, you can check out my 2008 Southwest Historical Quarterly article. Race was not a primary concern of the Texas Klan in the 20s. Rather, as one of Colonel Mayfield's headlines proclaimed, it's the KKK versus Jew, Jug, and Jesuits. I guess you could say he had a point on the Jug issue. The Cat Spring Germans had voted down the 1887 state prohibition referendum by a resounding 238-0. And they celebrated the 1911 vote against prohibition by carrying it to its grave accompanied by a brass band, prematurely as it turned out. Still, they remained rather unperturbed by the 18th Amendment, as the Agricultural Society's minutes record. In preparation for a festivity in 1922, and if this looks more like a dance hall to you than an agricultural society, you're kind of onto something. It was decided to order 40 gallons of ice cream, 3 gallons of orangeade, 5 kegs of beer. the sheriff and constable will be invited. In fact, from 1921 to 26, the minutes record orders for no less than 31 kegs of beer for the society's various balls and festivities. After 1926, beer purchases no longer show up in the minutes explicitly, but that doesn't mean they switched to lemonade. The sheriff, himself a Texas German, seems to have been a particular favorite of the society. He was expressly invited to at least 7 balls and festivities, and once presented with a box of cigars. And he was reelected no less than 5 times. One reason society could be so blatant about recording its extra-legal activities was that the minutes were still kept in German. As late as their 80th anniversary fest in 1936, there's mention of inviting a German speaker along with an English one. Finally, in April 1942, the society decided by unanimous vote to keep all further minutes in English. That, by the way, is not the record among Texas German institutions. The La Bahia Turnverein, which you may have just noticed on the right side of the road on your way to Round Top, only switched its records to English in 1946. Although most German speakers had a good command of English by that time, German was by no means dying out in Texas. The 1940 census records more than 70,000 Texans who were American-born of American parentage, but listed German as their mother tongue, and over 2,500 third-generation Czech speakers. In fact, Texas was the only state in the Union that had more third-generation than second-generation German speakers. And same was true of Poles. With Czechs, it was just neck and neck. But one of my students did a study of tombstones in Czech cemeteries and found that as late as the 1950s, 1/3 of the tombstone inscriptions were in the Czech language. In 1970, the census again enumerated mother tongue, this time giving county-level results. Even at this late date, Fredericksburg and the surrounding county had a German-speaking majority of 57%. It's the red county there on the slide. It was clearly in a category by itself, but German still remained viable even in some areas beyond the hill country. There were only 9 Texas counties where nobody claimed German mother tongue, but there were 13 counties where 15% or more of the population did. All the colors on the map except the yellow, where I repeat my newspaper data. Blue is the lowest category. The 6 green counties fall in the 20 to 30% range. But second in line statewide was Lee County, with 35% claiming German mother tongue, the orange one there. It's a great historical irony if you know the population makeup. Lee County had a heavy concentration of Sorbs, or what the Germans call Wends, from a Slavic language island in eastern Germany, who came to Texas in 1854, both to guard their Lutheran faith and to try to escape the pressures of Germanization. But joining a German Lutheran synod, they became so Germanized over here that at the turn of the 21st century, the Lutheran churches of Giddings and nearby Serbin still held German services once a month. But it's hard to fault the Sorbs. They were just assimilating to the dominant language in their area and their church body. On the issue of which culture to assimilate to, there's reliable evidence of black Texans who were fluent in Czech or German as a result of growing up amongst them and working with them. The story is told of a Chicago Czech traveling salesman who got off the train at some godforsaken little town on the railroad between Houston and San Antonio. He thought he heard someone speaking Czech, in fact, his local Moravian dialect, but all he saw on the platform were 2 black guys. Fearing that the Texas sun had cooked his brain, he walked over and without much thinking, asked the guy in Czech, of course, "Excuse me, but are you Czech?" And the black guy answered him, "Ne, ja su Moravik." "No, I'm Moravian." Although this sounds like a joke, since the salesman was identified by name, it probably has a basis in fact. And my evidence on blacks who spoke German is even more firmly grounded. In the early 90s, I advised a Bavarian woman who wrote a master's thesis at University of Houston on the relation of Texas Germans to slavery and blacks. And she actually interviewed an elderly black man born about 1928 in Trankman's home county who spoke fluent German. I kept lobbying Hans Boas of the UT Texas German Dialect Project to record and videotape this man, but he passed away unrecorded in 2010, probably the last of his kind. As an ethnic historian, I'm always doing informal research, and my students have proven to be great sources. As late as the mid-1990s, I had in my class a girl from Snook and a boy from Münster, way up there by Denton, who both said they had parents who knew no English when they started grade school, growing up exclusively with Czech or German. More recently, I had an ag major in class who had put off his U.S. history to his last semester and then missed an exam because of a livestock judging trip. When he came in for a makeup, his family name stood out, not just because it was Polish, but also because he shared it with the priest who founded Panna Maria, the first Polish settlement in Texas or the U.S., Mochegimba. Billy Bob Mochegimba, to be precise. You can't make up things like this, folks. Never fear, there wasn't any hanky-panky going on with the priest and his housekeeper. Several of his brothers had followed the priest to Panna Maria. Now, although the name Billy Bob might indicate Texas assimilation, I asked him how long the Polish language had held on in his family, and he replied that he had a great aunt who didn't know any English. But in the long run, the melting pot always wins out. By the year 2000, Spanish speakers outnumbered German speakers in the Braunfelds and the surrounding county by 8-1, and had pulled slightly ahead even in isolated Fredericksburg. Because of our proximity to the border, Spanish does show a greater viability across generations than other languages recently. But since this data is available right down to the county level, let's take a look at a worst-case scenario. Zavala County, Texas. Even the name probably sounds un-American to some of you, but it commemorates a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence and the Lone Star Republic's first vice president. According to the 2000 census, in a population of 10,500, nearly 9,000, or 85%, could speak Spanish. Somewhere down in hell, General Santa Anna is laughing. Or maybe not. Of these Spanish speakers, 79% spoke English well or very well. So if English is that widely spoken, even in the birthplace of La Raza Unida, I don't know what the rest of us need to worry about. And as for the preservation of ancestral languages, hey, it's an old Texas tradition. Thank you.